There were 3 suns over the ash ring, but you wouldn't have known it that morning. The sky wore a robe of smoke so thick and low it brushed the upper spires of the execution towers, turning the light into something more like memory than presence, dull, worn at the edges, reluctant to show itself. Kieran stood at the edge of the ring, dust grinding under his boots like bone shards. He didn't look at the others. Didn't look at the masked enforcers or the dozen onlookers who'd come not out of hatred or curiosity, but out of the quiet, tired obedience that made up most of life on Viardnine. He kept his gaze forward, fixed on the woman in the center. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. Even as the winds whipped ash around her shackled frame, even as the machine priests recited their half-code, half-prayer over the pyre's ignition system, she just stood. Hair tangled. Mouth dry. Eyes wide open, not in terror, but in defiance. Maybe in acceptance. Maybe both. She was not like the others who had stood in that circle before. She did not shrink. And Kieran knew, even before the heat touched her, even before he stepped forward, that he could not let her die like that. Not because he believed she was innocent. Not because she deserved a second chance. But because there was something in her eyes that said this world has not yet broken me, and he could not, would not, be part of the machine that tried. The ignition rune flared. A warning hum built beneath their feet. And he moved. Later, people would talk about the fire that never fully started. About how a sudden atmospheric downdraft, so rare it hadn't occurred in 40 years, snuffed the main line. They would speculate about sabotage, divine intervention, rebel interference. They would write reports and lose them in bureaucratic black holes. But none of them would mention the man who ran through the sparks before the guards could draw breath, who tore his cloak on the iron bindings, who slung the branded sinner over his shoulder and vanished into the smoke as if the planet itself had swallowed them whole. They wouldn't say his name. Because they didn't know it. Because he didn't wait to give it. She didn't wake until they were far from the ring. Far enough that the scent of burning stone had been replaced by damp moss and the faint tang of industrial coolant leaking from half-buried tunnels. She coughed first, sharp and sudden, like a body trying to remember how to survive. Then her eyes opened. And she looked at him. Really looked. "You should have let me burn," she rasped. Kieran knelt beside her, offering a canteen. "Maybe. But I didn't." She stared at him. Not with gratitude. Not with suspicion. Just stillness. Her voice came again, softer this time. "Do you know what I did?" "No. You're not going to ask?" "I figure you'll tell me. Or you won't." That seemed to puzzle her more than anything. People always wanted to know. Always wanted the story, the justification, the reason they could tuck into a moral pocket to carry safely home. But Kieran had lived too long in the backwash of empire and exile to believe that justice ever wore a single face. He didn't need her innocence. He just needed her alive. They didn't speak much for the first 2 days. She walked behind him, limping slightly but refusing help. He didn't offer more than once. He'd learned what pride looked like in the wounded. They slept in the old metro shafts under Sector 13, long abandoned since the flood wall failed a decade ago. Mold clung to the walls like regret. Sometimes they could hear the thrum of power lines still carrying ghost currents somewhere far above. He learned that she never slept through the night. That she woke with a start just before dawn, like her body feared forgetting where it was. He didn't ask why. He just learned to boil water early, so she would have something warm to hold when the shadows were slow to recede. She asked him once why he hadn't left her when she passed out. Why he hadn't taken what he wanted and gone. "I don't take what isn't offered," he said simply. "Even from someone marked a criminal? Especially then." And that night she said his name for the first time. "Kieran." He looked up from the small, flickering cook flame. "My name is Solène." The days that followed were not heroic. They were not filled with daring escapes or revelatory bonding. They were filled with aching silence, long treks through forgotten corridors, ration bars that tasted like chalk, and the slow, unspoken negotiation of 2 people learning how to occupy the same air. But there were moments. Small ones. Moments where Kieran caught Solène running her fingers along the moss growing in the cracks of the wall, eyes soft in a way that didn't match the burn scar across her collarbone. Moments where she asked him questions, not big ones, not personal, just questions. About how long he'd been on Viating. About what the sky looked like from other planets. About whether he thought the stars looked different if you looked at them upside down. And one night, as they sat beside the broken hull of a transport shuttle half swallowed by vines, she said, "They branded me because I loved the wrong person." Kieran didn't look at her, but he didn't move away either. "They told me I'd corrupted her. That I'd taken something pure and turned it. But it wasn't like that. We chose each other." He waited. Let her speak. "I didn't break the law by accident. I broke it on purpose. Because their law said love had to look one way. And I refused." Kieran nodded, slow. "Sounds like the kind of thing worth breaking for." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, not exactly. Just the reflection of a fire she hadn't let go out. By the time they reached the outer rim, a dense, jagged sprawl of collapsed mining rigs and fractured rail lines, they had stopped moving like strangers. They moved in tandem now, trading watch shifts, reading each other's silences. It wasn't trust exactly, but it was something near it. And when the local militia finally caught up, dragging smoke and searchlights behind them like a god's fury, it wasn't Kieran who reached for his weapon first. It was Solen. She didn't shoot to kill. Just to distract. To buy them a breath, a step, a doorway. But it was enough. Enough to remind him that survival is not an instinct. It's a choice. And she was choosing it. With him. They disappeared again that night. Into the dirt. Into the dark. Into the long road not marked on any map. And maybe they didn't have a future yet. But for the first time, they weren't running from the same thing. They were running toward something else. Something they hadn't named yet. Something that might grow if given the chance. The rains came late on Virt 9, sweeping in like a long-forgotten apology. When they did fall, it wasn't in a sudden rush or stormy violence. It was slower, more like the planet exhaled through damp soil and metal bones. The kind of rain that didn't erase the dust but turned it into something soft. Something that held footprints a little longer. Kieran and Solen had taken shelter in the shell of what had once been a way station, now a ruin stitched together by vines and rust. The roof leaked in 4 places. One of the walls had collapsed inward, revealing layers of circuitry, rebar, and a strange sort of moss that glowed faintly in the dark. They sat near what might once have been a locker unit, now hollowed out and serving as a sort of makeshift pantry, their food rations laid out in quiet ceremony, half an energy bar each, a canister of synth broth, and a peeled root Solen had foraged earlier, soaked in rain and bitter as a mistake. But she liked it. "You always let the rain hit your face," she said, not looking at him. Kieran shrugged. "Feels honest." She tore a bit from her bar, chewed. "I used to think rain was the sky's way of making you remember your body." He turned toward her, intrigued. "When I was young," she went on, "they taught us to avoid discomfort. That pain was a distraction. That weather was something to be managed. But discomfort teaches you that you're still here. That you haven't disappeared." He watched her for a long moment. There was a way she said these things, not like she was trying to sound profound, but like she'd just grown used to living in layers of thought most people never took the time to name. "I think that's why I stayed conscious at the pyre," she said after a pause. "I wanted to feel it. All of it. Even the end." Kieran didn't flinch. "You thought it was the end?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't think there was a version of the world where someone would step forward. Let alone someone who didn't know me." He looked down at his hands. They were calloused, dirt under the nails, a fresh scrape across the knuckle. "I didn't know you," he said, "but I knew the look in your eyes." She met his gaze. "What look?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, like you'd already lost everything, but still hadn't given them the satisfaction of taking you with it. Her breath caught. Not visibly. Not audibly. But something in her changed in that second, like a thread had been pulled loose in the silence between them. She didn't speak again for a while. They just ate in the slow hush of rain and metal, the silence between them no longer hollow but full of meaning too dense for words. Later that night, she asked if he had family. Kieran stared up at the dark ceiling, where the rain traced gentle rhythms across the cracked panels. "A sister. Somewhere." "You don't know." We lost track. That's how it works when people start running in different directions. Sometimes it's not an argument or a tragedy. Just a series of mischances. You look up one day and realize the road forked 5 turns back. Do you think she'd know who you are now? He gave a dry smile. I'm not sure I know who I am now. Solène nodded. Maybe that's the point. He rolled to his side, head resting on a rolled-up jacket, watching the dim glow from the moss creep across her face. Do you want to be found? Her answer came softly. I think I want to be seen. But I don't know if those are the same thing. They drifted into sleep after that, not at the same time, not with ceremony, but like two people who had grown used to each other's patterns, who didn't need permission to rest. The next morning, they walked. No destination. Just direction. Solène walked with more ease now. The burns across her shoulder had started to close, raw skin retreating under newly formed tissue. She still carried the brand across her left collar, 2 intersecting rings scorched into the skin, the mark of those who'd been declared morally unfit to participate in civil society. A ridiculous phrase on a planet where civility often looked like obedience wrapped in just enough cruelty to be palatable. They passed through an abandoned transit corridor that used to ferry workers from the outer fields to the central processing zone. Empty now. Just bones of machines and echoes of footfalls long faded. Solène reached out and traced a finger across one of the old warning signs, the lettering faded but still readable in patches. You are safe when you comply. She snorted. I used to believe that. Until I didn't. Kieran tilted his head. What changed? They asked me to turn her in, she said. The woman I loved. They told me if I just gave them her location, they'd let me go. Let me keep my work, my home. They said they'd erase my record. His silence gave her space. But I didn't, she continued. I couldn't. She would have done the same for me. Or maybe she wouldn't have. I don't know. That's not the point. She stopped walking. Turned to him. I didn't do it because I loved her. I did it because I knew what I'd become if I did. He nodded. Not in approval. Just in understanding. Sometimes morality wasn't about what you gained or lost. It was about what you could still bear to carry in the quiet parts of your own mind. That night, they camped in the bones of a comms tower. One of the few still standing, though long dead. Cables snaked down like vines, and the stars overhead blinked into view, hesitant through the lingering smoke of the previous days. Solène stared upward, lying flat on her back, her palms open beside her, as if waiting to catch the stars themselves. Do you ever think about how small we are? She asked. All the time. Doesn't scare you? No, he said. It reminds me that whatever they did to us, it doesn't own the sky. She turned her head, met his eyes. There was no smile, just warmth. And for a moment, they weren't fugitives. They weren't survivors. They were just two beings under the same endless sky, each holding some small flame inside themselves that hadn't gone out. Not yet. Not tonight. The wreckage they stumbled upon 2 days later looked like it had fallen from the sky long before either of them had arrived on Vierting. An old cargo shuttle, its nose sheared off in a clean diagonal line, rested half-buried in sand and creeping brush. Moss had started colonizing its seams. Vines wove through the hull like the world had decided to claim it back, bit by bit, without hurry or permission. Solène stepped carefully through the broken bay doors first. Kieran followed, sweeping the low light of his wrist lamp across the interior. The air inside was dry and still, the kind that had been left undisturbed for years, long enough for the scent of metal and oil to become just memory. They didn't say anything at first. Not out of awe or fear, but out of a kind of reverence, like walking through the bones of something that had once breathed. It felt like shelter. So they made it one. They spent that night clearing space. Not because it was urgent, there were no patrols this far out, no recent signs of scanners, but because there was comfort in the act of restoring something, even if only partially. Kieran took to repairing what he could, stabilizing beams, patching holes in the inner wall using wire mesh and thermal paste from his pack. Solène found crates of dry insulation material still intact and used it to soften the floor, shaping their own corner of safety out of discarded history. They worked without needing to explain. No instructions. Just rhythm. Just shared motion. That night, as they lay beside each other near the rear cargo hold, listening to the faint creaks of metal settling under its own weight, Solène exhaled like she hadn't in days. "It feels like a real place," she murmured. "Not just a stop along the way." Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe it is." She turned toward him in the dark, not to question, but to simply be closer. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to stop running?" she asked. He thought for a while. "Sometimes. But I think I'm more afraid of standing still." She nodded. "Yeah. Me too." But she reached for his hand anyway. And he didn't pull away. By the third day, they turned the shuttle into something that resembled a home. At least, a version of it neither of them had thought possible anymore. Kieran had found a functioning solar bank, mostly drained but salvageable, and spent most of the afternoon rerouting it to power a single heating node. Solène had set up a space for sorting and drying roots and herbs she'd foraged, creating a corner filled with small, drying bundles that smelled faintly of sage and salt. They didn't talk much while they worked. It wasn't silence born of tension. It was something gentler. Like neither of them wanted to break whatever was growing in the space between them. Later, as dusk settled, they sat outside on the broken wing of the shuttle. The sky above them was streaked with soft oranges and bruised purples, the kind of horizon that looked like it might remember you if you let it. Solène broke the silence first. "When I was 15, I thought I'd be a pilot," she said. "I trained on simulators. Read every manual I could steal from the archives. I knew engines better than my own thoughts." "What changed?" Kieran asked. She gave a half laugh. "The world. The rules. I got told who I could be. Who I couldn't love. What I was allowed to want." He looked at her. "You still sound like a pilot." She smiled faintly. "I don't think I'm anything anymore." Kieran turned his gaze back to the horizon. "You don't have to be anything for me." That hit something deep. And she knew he meant it. Later, after the last of the day's light had faded and they sat eating from the last of their rations for the week, she spoke again, this time without armor. "I keep waiting for you to change." Kieran glanced at her, unsure. "Change how?" She shifted slightly, looking down at her hands. "I don't know. Maybe to become cruel. Or distant. Or tired of me. That's what always happens. People start soft, then harden." He set his food down, slowly. "Maybe I'm already hardened," he said. "Maybe what you see is what I became after." Her brow furrowed slightly. He continued, voice low, even. "I've seen enough people choose to become smaller than their grief. Choose safety over truth. I did it too for a while. Thought if I just kept my head down, stayed out of the fire, maybe I'd survive long enough to not care anymore. And now?" He looked at her. "You make me care again." There was a moment when she could have made it a joke, or turned away, or met him with silence. But she didn't. Instead, she reached across the space between them and touched the side of his face, thumb tracing the edge of his jaw like she was checking to see if he was real. And for once, he let her. They didn't kiss that night. There was no rush, no aching crescendo, no dramatic weight to the moment. There was just touch. There was just presence. And it was enough. In the days that followed, they stayed. Not because they were safe. Not because the world had forgiven them. But because they had found something that didn't need forgiveness. Something like belonging. Something like rest. And even though they knew it couldn't last, not forever, they stopped pretending it couldn't matter. Some things are worth holding, even if you know you'll have to let go. Especially then. There are kinds of silence that carry weight. The silence after loss. The silence of distance. But there is another kind. A silence born from familiarity. From knowing that everything that needs to be said is already understood. The kind that fills space not with absence, but with presence. That was the kind of silence that wrapped around Kieran and Solène as the 6th day inside the downed shuttle began. No alarms. No threats. No need to whisper or run or scan every ridge on the horizon for movement. Just the hum of solar flow pulsing gently through the makeshift panels, and the soft clicks of Solène rearranging her drying herbs again, even though they didn't need it. Kieran watched her for a long time. Not to study her. Not because he didn't know her yet. But because watching her had become part of how he stayed grounded. She moved like she was always halfway between action and stillness. Not restless, aware. Her body never wasting energy, her hands confident without being showy. It made sense. He thought that she would have been a pilot. It wasn't just the precision. It was the way she didn't flinch from space. Physical, emotional, all of it. "You're staring," she said, not looking up. "You always know. I know the rhythm of your silences." Kieran smiled softly and rose, brushing dust from his hands. "I'm going to check the western ridge. I thought I saw a glint yesterday. Might have been an old sensor node. Could be useful." She nodded, eyes still on her work. "Be careful." It was a simple thing. But when she said it, it felt like a promise being asked for, not a rule. And he liked that. The ridge wasn't far, just past a dried-up ravine marked by pale blue lichen that clung to the rocks like frost. The glint he'd seen turned out to be just that, an old transmitter dish long since decommissioned, its surface cracked, wires like veins snapped in the wind. But he sat with it anyway. Sometimes the act of looking, of reaching out, felt like resistance in itself. He touched the edge of the dish, ran his thumb along a fractured seam. There was something comforting about the brokenness of the thing, how it had once been vital, part of a system, a network. And now, discarded, it still reflected sunlight. Still caught someone's attention. Still mattered in its way. He stayed until the light shifted. Then walked back. Solène was waiting by the shuttle, leaning against the hull with her arms folded, the faintest smile on her lips. "No incoming death squads?" she asked. "Not today," Kieran said. "I made tea." That was new. They'd heated water before. Purified it. Added herbs when they could. But she called it tea. Like it was a ritual. A choice. He followed her inside. She handed him a cracked metal cup, still warm. The smell was earthy, a little bitter, with a sweetness that lingered underneath like something remembered rather than tasted. He sipped. "This is good." She didn't answer right away. Just drank her own in silence. Then quietly, "Some of the leaves I used, my grandmother used to dry them above our stove. She said they kept nightmares away." Kieran looked at her. "You never talk about your family." "I don't know how much is memory and how much is imagination," she admitted. "But sometimes the difference doesn't matter." He nodded. There were whole sections of his past that felt more like stories than lived experience now. Things remembered in fragments, feelings more than facts. "I think it's enough to remember what something felt like," he said. "Even if the details blur." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That's what this place feels like." He didn't need to ask what she meant. This shuttle. These days. All of it. A memory in the making, held not for its sharpness, but for the warmth it would leave behind. They sat close that night not because of the cold, but because it had become their way. Her head found its place just beneath his collarbone, her breath steady against his chest. "You don't flinch when I touch you anymore," she murmured. "I used to." "You used to hold your breath." He ran his fingers through her hair slowly, tracing patterns without thought. "I didn't realize I was waiting to be hurt. And now." He paused. "I think now I'm just waiting to be changed." She pulled back slightly, enough to look at him. "I won't leave a mark like theirs." He touched the edge of the brand on her collar, featherlight. "I wouldn't mind." She leaned into him again. "I would." In the middle of the night, he woke to the sound of rain tapping against the hull again. It wasn't storming, just soft, steady, insistent. He lay there, eyes open, listening. Solène's hand was resting on his chest, fingers curled slightly, her body warm against his. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to keep one open. The next morning, they worked together without speaking. Rechecking their perimeter sensors, filtering water from the basin behind the ridge, repacking their bags, not because they were leaving, but because it felt right to be ready. When the sun finally rose high enough to bleach the sky into pale gold, Kieran sat down beside her on the wing again. "I think we're going to have to move soon," he said. Solène nodded. "I know." They didn't talk about why. Not about the dwindling supplies, or the smoke they'd spotted yesterday in the far distance, or the message he'd intercepted on the old relay node. Encrypted, brief, a search request still pinging the sector. They just sat together and let the wind move around them. "I'm not afraid of leaving," she said. "Me neither. But I want to take this with me." He turned toward her. "You already have." That night, before they lay down to rest again, Solène placed something in his hand. A tiny bundle of dried leaves, tied with string. "For your pack," she said. "In case we get separated." He didn't say we won't, because even Hope had to learn humility here. But he closed his fingers around it, and he held it to his chest. They didn't leave because the threat arrived. They left because the silence started to feel thinner. There are ways the world warns you, through birds falling quiet, through the pause between wind gusts, through the way machines that should have been long dead start flickering faint signals again, as though waking to some call that wasn't meant for you. Kieran noticed it first. A small vibration in the ground as they walked the perimeter, just enough to unsettle dust from the walls of the old relay. Not seismic. Not weather. Just not right. "We should move by morning," he told her, and she didn't ask why. She simply packed her bag like it was a continuation of breath, and not the breaking of comfort. Because they'd both known it wouldn't last. But that didn't make it easier. They left just before sunrise. The shuttle stood quiet behind them, half swallowed again by the planet's slow insistence, like the place was trying to reclaim what had once fallen. Solène turned once before walking on, just once, long enough to glance at the wing where they used to sit together. Kieran didn't look back. Not because he didn't care. Because he was trying to carry it forward instead. They traveled light. Half rations, 2 flasks of filtered water, the solar knife, the comms crystal, still without signal, and the tea leaves she'd given him, which he kept tucked in his inner jacket pocket, wrapped in a corner of cloth torn from her old tunic. It wasn't superstition. It was anchor. The terrain ahead was quieter, flatter, more exposed. Nothing to hide behind for kilometers. That kind of openness had its own kind of tension, like walking across a stage without a script. Kieran scanned the skyline every few minutes out of habit, though he knew if anything came now, it would come from above. Drones. Orbitals. Maybe even a long-range scan ping from a satellite that hadn't registered life signs out here in decades. But there was no way to know. Only to keep walking. Solène kept pace with him, steps measured, jaw set, not tight, not angry. Just focused. She wasn't afraid of being caught anymore. She was afraid of not getting to choose when and how the ending came. That he understood. After hours of silence, she asked, "What if the message you intercepted wasn't about me?" Kieran glanced at her. "Then someone else is in danger." She nodded. "Would you go to them?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "If I thought I could help. Even if it meant leaving me?" He slowed his steps. Met her gaze. "I wouldn't leave you," he said, "but I might ask if you'd come with me." She considered that. Let it sit. "I think I would," she said, and she said it not because she owed him anything, but because it was true. Then, more softly, "It's strange, isn't it? How easy it is to imagine dying for someone. But choosing to go on with someone, that takes more." He reached for her hand. Not urgently. Not to hold. Just to be beside. They walked like that for hours. 2 shadows cast long in the low sun, stretched thin and real and human. By dusk, they found the wreckage of what had once been a listening post, long dismantled, its core hollowed by scavengers or rust. Kieran tested the structural integrity, then nodded toward the leaning wall. "We can take a few hours. Let the night pass." Inside it was dry. Wind whistled through a vent, but the place had weight. Shelter. Solène sat with her back to the wall, legs pulled in, arms resting loose on her knees. "You were in the military once," she said after a while. "Weren't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You don't talk like one." "I stopped being a soldier long before I stopped wearing the uniform." She looked at him. "Why?" He picked up a broken comm unit from the ground, turned it in his hands. "There was an op," he said quietly. "A clean-up run. We were told the outpost had gone dark, likely sabotage. We were told to secure it and report. No questions. He paused, eyes distant now. When we got there, it wasn't sabotage. They'd shut themselves down on purpose. Because they'd discovered what our systems were really tracking. People. Civilians. Deviants. Anyone flagged by the algorithm. Solène didn't speak. She just listened. They didn't want to be part of it. So they tried to disappear. My unit was ordered to re-establish the grid. We were told not to engage if they didn't resist. And they did. He nodded once. They resisted. She reached for his hand again. Not to reassure. Just to be there. I didn't fire, he said. But I didn't stop it either. Not in time. You did now. He looked at her. You stepped forward when no one else did. His voice cracked a little at the edge. It doesn't undo it. No, she said. But maybe it's not about undoing. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Maybe it's about doing something different. And choosing to keep doing it. That night, they shared the last of the root tea. It wasn't hot enough. It tasted too much like soil. But it was theirs. They lay down under a crumbling support beam and looked at the slice of stars between cracks in the roof, and said nothing more. The silence between them had changed again. Now it felt like a promise. They would move again in the morning. The signal would get stronger. The world would grow louder again. But for now, there was only this. A half-dark room. Two people who were not running anymore, but walking toward something not yet named. And the quiet knowledge that when the time came to rise again, they would do it side by side. They didn't reach the coast the way they thought they would. Not in triumph. Not in flight. Just step by step. Over ridgelines thinned by wind, through canyons etched with old mining scars, across plains so flat the horizon didn't curve, it just stopped. And beyond that, at the edge of what used to be a planetary shipping port, the ocean waited. Not blue. Not clean. But vast. When they saw it for the first time, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, bags hanging from tired shoulders, their shadows cast behind them in long, quiet lines. The wind from the water moved across them like a hand, cool, uninvited, and honest. This is it, Kieran said after a while. Solène nodded. Doesn't look like salvation. No, he replied. But it looks like choice. That was enough. The old launch yard was a skeleton now, giant metal arms rusting into the soil, once meant to carry freight skyward, now split and hollow like a ribcage left behind by something that had flown away and never looked back. They found a small comms terminal tucked beneath a maintenance platform. Kieran checked the grid, low-level energy still pulsed faintly through its wiring. Local only. No orbital reach. But enough to send a low-band beacon. Enough to say, we're still here. Solène knelt beside him, her hands brushing dust from the screen. If we call them, she said, we can't take it back. I know. They might still be looking for me. He met her gaze. Then we call someone else. She raised an eyebrow. Someone who knows what it's like to be burned and still keep walking. Someone who doesn't care what the records say. He keyed in the frequency manually. A number he hadn't used in years. His sister's. The one he thought he'd lost. He didn't send a message right away. Just uploaded a single data point, coordinates, timestamp, and a short tag. Need away OFF world. Not alone. Not safe. Worth the risk. He sat back on his heels and exhaled. Solène watched him. You trust her? I trust she'll understand, he said. She used to be the one dragging me out of trouble. I think this time, she might want to be pulled into something. That night, they lit a small fire in the shelter of the shipyard's engine trench. They didn't talk about where they'd go. They didn't fantasize about new names, or fresh starts, or the myth of clean slates. They talked about ordinary things. How tea always tastes different depending on who boils the water. How neither of them remembered the constellations the same way. How silence, once terrifying, had become a language they both spoke fluently now. They sat shoulder to shoulder, not because they were afraid, but because this was how they had always chosen to face the world, together. Kieran passed her a ration bar. She made a face. It's not even food. It's a suggestion, he said. She laughed, quiet and real. Do you think people can ever really stop running? She asked. He thought about it. I think people don't stop because they feel safe. I think they stop when they're not alone anymore. She leaned her head on his shoulder again. Then I guess we've already stopped. The beacon blinked 3 times around midnight. Incoming signal. Unidentified vessel rerouting from outer orbit. ETA, 6 hours. Kieran showed her the readout. She looked at him for a long moment. Not afraid. Not questioning. Just present. Is this the part where we pretend we're ready? She asked. No, he said. This is the part where we admit we never will be. She smiled. Good. Dawn came soft and gray, light spreading across the wreckage like paint left too long in water. The ship was just a shape on the horizon at first, then a hum, then a shadow that grew wings. It didn't land close. Just near enough. Kieran shouldered the pack. Solène tied her jacket tighter around her waist. Neither of them reached for weapons. They didn't need to. They walked slowly. Together. And when they reached the bay doors and the ramp hissed open with a breath of recycled air, they didn't hesitate. They stepped inside. Not to disappear. But to continue. Because sometimes, surviving wasn't about fleeing. Sometimes, surviving meant carrying someone out of the fire. And learning how to live after. Not as sinners. Not as fugitives. But as people who stayed soft in a world that tried to harden them. People who found each other when there was nothing left to find. And chose to